All right, so thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. Always a pleasure to come back to Cornell, but I noticed when I walked into the room that this is an unusual experience for me because I'm not used to being in a room full of women, believe it or not. And I realized that for the first time in many years when I walked in here today, and I wondered to myself, why is that? Why is that? That's very funny now that I come to think of it in 2017, that this doesn't happen very often. So I'm really pleased to be here to speak with you today, and thank you, Madeline, for that very kind introduction. As she told you, I've had a lot of corporate experience, and I recently started teaching at Rutgers Business School, and they asked me to develop this leadership course. I think they asked me because I've been a leader in for-profit businesses like American Express, Burger King, Levi Strauss, nonprofit companies like Sesame Workshop, and some businesses in the education field, and new ventures in education, consumer products, and now technology. So I've had a range of leadership experiences, but I am very passionate about this topic, not because of those leadership experiences, because believe it or not, I didn't receive training to be a leader there. It was kind of like trial by fire, but what I understood is what really prepared me to be a leader is the fact that I never fit in. So I'm going to tell you more about that later, but that's really very pertinent to my talk today. So let's see. Okay, and so every section I kind of start. Sorry, what's the problem? Oh, should I use the mic? All right. All right, so that's probably much better, right? Okay, all right, do it. Let me put this. All right, maybe I got to put them both on this side. Yeah, because it looks like the hook goes that way.
Excuse me.
All right, thank you.
Is that better?
All right, you can hear me now, right? Great, all right. So I start each major section with a quote, and the first thing that I mentioned, it's obvious to everybody, we're undergoing a lot of change, right? Even in the 20th century, Marshall McLuhan said that the biggest change of the 20th century was change itself. I have no idea what he would say today if he were alive and here, because certainly we're experiencing quite a lot of it. And there are three major trends, three major changes that are taking place that I want to bring up today. And you're suffering through all of them, but I want to use this as kind of the context for my remarks. And the first is technology. And not only do we have a lot of technology, we have access to all of this information, more information than we know what to do with, and the pace that this information is coming at us, the ways that we can access it, is accelerating and becoming increasingly confusing. So just about every piece of information is at our fingertips. And now we have to contend with artificial intelligence, IBM Watson coming into various functions that may have implications for the future of work. And with all of these devices, all of this rapidly changing technology, it's changing the way that we operate, the way that we live our lives, and it's happening so fast that we barely have a moment to catch our breath and realize what's taking place. So I don't know if you read, but a couple of years ago, Microsoft published a report where they reported that recently tested attention span for human beings had dropped from 12 seconds in the year 2000 to just 8 seconds in 2015, 1 second less than a goldfish, hence that headline over there. And so, and not only that, this is changing the way that our economy operates as well. So fewer and fewer people have full-time jobs now, and fewer people can expect long-term employment. We're moving into something that's called the gig economy, and I'm sure that you're all very familiar with that, but people in my generation aren't familiar with that, and yet just about everybody I know is thrown into the fire dealing with this in one way or another, because that's the way the world is operating these days. And along the way, our institutions are breaking down. So another major factor is globalization. So because of globalization, we have more diversity than we've ever had before, more interdependence than we've ever had before, and more ambiguity, because all of these changes are coming from random places, and all of them, because of this interdependence, have unexpected consequences that are totally unexpected. So for example, even 15 years ago when I was at Levi's, I had an employee, this was in Levi's Korea, I was the country manager for Levi's Korea, and I had an employee who had done his education in Australia, and when he went there, it was a paradise because Koreans love seafood, and they especially love abalone. It's a delicacy in Korea. It's very hard to get, very, very expensive. And all he had to do was go to the beach, and the beach was covered with abalone. But by the time we were at Levi's, when he'd go back to vacation there, the abalone was almost gone because all of a sudden all these Korean students started to study in Australia, and that cleaned up the beaches pretty quickly after a few years. So all of these unintended consequences are happening, and that's only a minor one. We know that the potential impacts of these consequences are much, much greater than that small anecdote. But what makes things even more confusing and even harder to understand what's going on and get a grasp of this is all of these forces are happening independently of each other, even though they're interdependently influencing each other. And so it's become almost impossible to anticipate the future, to understand what's going on, to get a grasp of it, to lead, to even manage. So the world is becoming a much more complicated place. And the third major change is people are changing as well, especially in developed economies. It's no longer enough just to earn a living, just to have food on the table and everything like that. People want more. We've kind of gone up Maslow's hierarchy, and people are they care a lot about self-actualization. The B Corps has become very important. They expect more from their companies, they expect more from their institutions at a time when it's harder than ever for those institutions to operate and stay in business. And they also expect more out of their own lives. So they expect some sort of fulfillment, some sort of personal purpose, and in a world that's full of chaos. So this is becoming harder and harder. And when we have so much diversity and so much change in the world, not only are our institutions deteriorating, but so are our traditions. The family has changed dramatically. Institutions of marriage and how we interact with each other have changed dramatically. And we haven't necessarily found ways to accommodate all of our needs in this new world. So that's a whole nother conversation. We could talk a lot about that, but that's forcing change on us before we understand even what's taking place. And so because this is happening so rapidly and in such a confusing manner, there's a gap between what our reality is and our preparation for it. And we can talk about the gap in any number of ways, but because we're talking about leadership today, I'm going to talk about it in terms of the workforce. These figures here are based on a study done by the World Economic Forum. And they said that in 2020, only 50% of the skills that employers are demanding today will be needed by then. And that the jobs that we're going to have in 2020 will require completely different skills than we can anticipate today. And even today, the biggest complaint about employers is finding people who meet the qualifications that they're seeking. So what's going to happen in 2020? And by the way, do you realize that 2020 is only 2 years away? How are we going to fill this gap, right? This is very concerning to everybody. We don't know and we don't even know if there are going to be jobs in the future. So you guys know that we're talking about a jobless economy, and there are experiments going on with that. So in this kind of world, leadership has become more important than ever. Because how do you operate in a world where you don't understand, where you don't see the future, where we don't have common values, common traditions, common expectations that we can depend on to make things easy? How do you operate? People have to step forward and be a leader. So today, in just about every report that you'll see, the number one qualification that employers are seeking, that corporations are needing, that countries need, that everybody needs, is leadership. And there are two kinds of leadership. There's the cognitive skills as well as the interpersonal skills, but all of it is in short supply. So more important than ever. So let's talk about what is leadership. And Walter, I made a mistake here. His name is Warren Bennis, not Walter Bennis, sorry. I always, this technology and pace of change gets the better of me too, so I'm always multitasking and it always is a mistake. But anyway, Warren Bennis was one of the most prolific early academicians studying leadership, and he said that it's really about you yourself. And that sounds like a very simple concept, but perhaps it makes it more complicated than everything. Leadership is one of those big words that's really hard to define, like love, or I don't know, life, or things like that. There's so much that goes into it. So, and what's surprising, and I didn't know this because I've just been a practitioner my entire career. I've only started teaching recently, but when they asked me to put together this course, I had to delve a little bit into the literature, and I found out that leadership is a modern concept. It first appeared about in 1821. And when we look at the dictionary definitions of leadership, they're not satisfying because they just talk about the role or talk about generic actions, but they don't really give us a sense of what it means to be a leader, how to be a good leader. And if we do a Google search, you can see there are almost 1 billion search items. And yes, there's a lot of overlap there, but there is also a huge diversity. And the thing is, since I started teaching this course about a year and a half ago, I've looked up leadership on Google maybe every 6 months or so, and every time I look it up, there's about 100 million additional search items. So this is also like spinning out of control in terms of leadership education or interest in leadership, because everybody knows that's what's in short supply and that's what we need moving forward. And so if we turn from Google and look at the people who are actually studying leadership, even among them, there's not a whole lot of agreement. There are over 100 definitions of leadership, and some of them do have a little bit of overlap, but there's also a big diversity. So leadership is a big field. We don't have an easy way to explain it, and there's no unified definition for leadership. But it's a concept that has evolved with our ages. So you know that before the 18th century, there wasn't much need for leadership because there wasn't much change in the world, and leadership is all about change. So when we were an agrarian economy, people for generations pretty much had the same lifestyle, and the leadership, they inherited their roles. They were the nobility, they were the rulers, so there wasn't any need for that. It was really during the industrial age where people started to come together, and you had hierarchies, you had corporations where people at different ranks had to work together in very different types of roles. That management science and subsequently leadership science became important. And then later on, we moved into the information age in mid-20th century, and leadership became even more important because people were operating more independently. But today, we're moving into what can be called the conceptual age. So just having information is not enough. We can Google anything. Information is worthless if you don't have the other things that are necessary: the leadership thinking, the creativity, the conceptual ability that goes with it. And so today, we can say that that's more important than ever. And what's involved in that is the ability to make a vision, the ability to create something that doesn't exist today, the ability to work together, collaborate with other people, the ability to bridge differences, et cetera, et cetera. And if we look at the leadership literature over those same eras, you can see that this is just, this is not even all of the studies that have taken place during the period, but there have been some major trends, and they kind of correspond with those eras. So once again, during the early days, the leaders were the rulers. We didn't even think of them as leaders. We thought of them as rulers. Then after the Civil War, we started to see a little bit of development of a class system that was beyond the ruling class. Agriculture began to modernize a little bit and require overseers and foremen and people like that. In the Industrial Revolution, scientific measurements, doing things more efficiently became very important. After World War II, social systems, equality, questions like that became very important. So leadership went through an era that was more HR-centered, people-centered. Later on in the 20th century, we went through a period of the celebrity CEO. Charisma became a very important concept. Recently, that's kind of fallen out of favor, because if it was only charisma, well, you know, we know that people like Hitler are not leaders that we really want around. And if it only took things like charisma and personality traits like extroversion and popularity and things like that, then we would see a lot of actors and football captains and prom queens being leaders, and we don't see that. So leadership is more complicated than just that. So, and here are a few leaders that I think are representative of those eras. So Henry Ford, very much associated with the assembly line. Ray Kroc was, we associate him with McDonald's in general, but he turned McDonald's from a mom and pop operation into a corporation, so he was really part of that corporate era. Jack Welch was all about efficiency. So thanks to Jack Welch, he popularized things like Six Sigma, the SMART goals. He also went on a mergers and acquisition binge and insisted that all of his businesses were number 1 or 2 in their industries. And additionally, he rank ordered all of the employees, and every year the bottom 10% would have to leave the corporation. So he was all about being the best. And then we added creativity to the mix and vision with Steve Jobs. And today, I don't know who is going to be the representative leader of this era, and I don't even know how long this era is going to last. Is it going to be 2 years, 6 months? We don't know. Things are happening so quickly. But one leader that I'm watching is Laszlo Bock. And Laszlo Bock used to be a McKinsey consultant. But while he was doing, he enjoyed it a lot, but while he was doing it, he was thinking, well, I can't do this forever. Where is it, you know, this is not going to fulfill me. Where is it that I really want to develop my excellence? So he looked around and he noticed in his client assignments that people made a huge difference. This was a surprise to me also when I became a leader, because before, when I was a manager, I always thought it was about the work, about working hard, getting stuff done. But when you become a leader, you find that that's really secondary. It's all about the people, and if you can think about that, everything, you know, 95% of the job is solved. But he noticed that, he saw that in businesses. Some businesses had people that worked really well together and others not so much. And he also looked around at where people were focusing for their careers, and he noticed that almost nobody paid any attention to HR. They even called it the HR ghetto. And so he thought, oh, okay, this is the future. So he put his stake there. He ended up moving to GE, which had among the most progressive HR policies, and eventually ended up at Google. And so I don't know, you guys are pretty young, so I don't know how aware you were of Google's hiring practices earlier this century, but they used to hire people that they thought were the best based on things like GPA. And no matter how old you are, if I had joined Google, they would have insisted that I I give them my SAT scores and my GPA. I don't know how I would get those things, but anyway, they insisted on things like that. And during the interview, they would give you these weird brain teasers, like how many M&Ms could you fill this room with, or something strange like that. So Laszlo Bock came in and he got rid of all of that. And he said, there's a better way. And we can find better people than that. He really humanized the environment. And he made Google into the very employee-friendly place that it's known to be today. I think Google usually comes up as the #1 place to work at. And that's largely attributed to the work that he did. He also did a lot of work that had ramifications throughout corporate America, maybe even global corporate. Because he did things like some very interesting research on teams. So they had a lot of teams in Google, and not many of them, especially in the early days, had any sort of training. They were all very young, and they didn't know how to train them efficiently, so they wanted to learn. So they studied the more effective teams, and they noticed that effective teams had almost nothing in common. Are people familiar with this research? Okay, so they had almost nothing in common. But what was surprising is they did have a couple of things in common. So first of all, there was psychological safety. So everybody felt comfortable, no matter whether it was a very formal environment or a very loose, laid-back environment, everybody felt comfortable contributing and saying whatever was on their mind. So all important information was shared. And the other very important thing is everybody contributed about the same amount of time. So it might not be all in the same meeting, but over the course of the work period or whatever it is, everybody had about equal weight in terms of having a voice. And so with things like that, his influence went far beyond Google, far beyond Silicon Valley. And he recently left Google to start up a company called Humu. And he can't even define what that company is going to be, except that he wants to use what he's learned and what he will learn in the future to make the people work better and be more fulfilled in whatever their environments are. So it's very curious. You can sign up if you're interested. They'll say, we'll eventually have jobs, or if you just want to keep in touch, add your name to the list. But anyway, I don't know whether he's going to have longevity, but he's doing some of the more interesting things that I see out there. So let's get back to what is leadership. It's a little bit easier to say what leadership is not, and leadership is not management. So for the longest time, when I went to business school, we studied management. And many of the courses that are taught at Rutgers Business School today, they didn't exist when I was in school. And so I've taught a few of them. It was hard for me because I had no reference point to think back to. And I never studied this myself. I just was a practitioner, like I said. But leadership, and I studied management, not leadership, but leadership is not management, because management is all about doing a good job. It's all about preserving the status quo, about making things work. And leadership is about breaking things, about destroying things and creating new things. So it's not management. And it's not about the position either. So probably most of the bosses that I've had over the course of my career, they haven't been leaders. They've been managers, or they've been something else, but they haven't been what we think about as a leader. A leader has to have a vision. A leader has to be able to bring people into that vision and expand that vision with the people. And not many people have thought about that, because all of these discussions around leadership are fairly recent, and they're not necessarily happening in corporate America in the work groups. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not about personality. So it is about creating the future. And one other thing besides destruction and vision that's required for leadership is that it also requires action. You can't just sit back and be a leader. Leadership happens through action and interaction. And these days, although there's still not a whole lot of agreement on leadership, the thinking around leadership that is very on trend these days are authentic leadership, servant leadership, and emergent leadership. Authentic leadership is the idea that there is no one successful style of leader. So just like Laszlo Bock, when he was looking for effective teams, he saw that they came in all shapes, sizes, and styles. When we look at effective leaders, we also see the same thing. There is no one mold for a leader. And so the thinking is that you need to understand that and look inside first to find your authentic self. And if you can find that and make it resonate, then people that will appeal to people, that will draw people, because they will understand that you are touching something authentic, something true, something that they can follow. Servant leadership is the idea that the job of the worker is not to serve the leader, it's vice versa. The job of the leader is to make it possible for the workers to do their job. And some of this comes out of the Japanese just-in-time keiretsu work, where whoever had the expertise called the shots on the assembly line. But some of it is also coming about because of the increasing complexity of our organizations. So if you work in corporate America today as a leader, you don't have control over a lot of things. We're no longer thinking about business in terms of the walls of a corporation. Today, more competition is being done by networks, groups of corporations that are operating together. So for example, McDonald's, they have their franchisees, they have their suppliers, they have their farmers who are even further down the supply chain, they have their employees, they have their consumers, they have, the list goes on, and all of them form an ecosystem where they compete together. So we're seeing more and more business happening in that kind of world, which means that the leader doesn't even know about all of the constituents in their business's universe. Even within the walls of a corporation, you don't have to be at the very top. You could be a mid-level manager, and you might have people on your team that you never get to meet in person because they're all over the world. And these people may operate in an environment where the laws are different, the customs are different, certainly time zones will probably be different. Everything can be different. And if you haven't experienced that, it's very hard for you to even realize that there's a question or there's a difference that needs to be explored. So everything has become much more complicated. So the idea is the leader in this environment can't know very much. So your employees are the experts, but nobody can be the expert of everything. So what can you do to make your employees more effective? And finally, the idea of emergent leadership, which means that whoever has the skill, whoever has the ability and the inclination can stand up and lead at the moment. It doesn't require anybody calling the shots, it doesn't require a title, it doesn't require anybody giving permission or anything like that. And more in this complex, churning environment, that's the kind of leadership that's really important. And that's also the way in corporate America, usually promotions don't come cleanly. They don't come because you've worked hard or something like that. They've come because you're already doing the work. So operating as an emergent leader is a very important way to behave because you're going to show, I can already do the job ahead. Okay. All right, so now we're going to get into the stuff about what makes leadership hard. This may be a little bit sensitive, but I'm going to make a bold statement. I'm going to say just about everything that you've learned and that you believe is either untrue or only partially true. And this was my biggest shock that I learned during, not recent, this happened a little bit before, but so I told you I spent most of my career in corporate America, but then about 10, 15 years ago, I just accidentally happened into the education industry. And when I joined it, I was shocked. I was shocked because I had always been involved with education. Obviously, I was a student. I had children as well, and within our family, we had probably had every possible education experience in the world, and I volunteered pretty actively in all of these schools too. So I was shocked when I joined Sesame Workshop and started to study education around the world, to learn that it was a major problem. The education systems were broken everywhere, and it was #1 priority of most countries around the world to fix them. In 2004, the OECD came out with a PISA study, and I forget what it stands for, but basically what they did is they would have their member countries, certain students, I think in 8th grade, and I don't remember, it's been a while, 4th grade and 8th grade, or 6th grade and 8th grade, something like that, take tests. And initially it was in math and reading. And this was a huge blow in the face to many of the member countries, because US came in way below average, and Germany, who had prided itself on its rigorous education, they came in just average. And it was a shock to many, many of the participants. And meanwhile, #1 was Finland and countries like Korea and Singapore. So this was a shock to everybody. And later on they added science, and so it really got the developed countries thinking about their problems in education. And meanwhile, the developing countries who wanted to join the OECD and other developed nation organizations like that realized that the major gap between where they were today and where they wanted to be was their education system. So they needed to fix that. And everybody, because everybody's been exposed to education, everybody thinks they're an expert. And what we've been exposed to is not necessarily best practice. In fact, very little of it is best practice, because another thing that I found is in the education system, especially in the public education systems, much of what we're exposed to has nothing to do with education. It has a lot to do with politics. And the education system is a little over 150 years old, but the reason that it was created was not really to give us an education. So before the Industrial Revolution, most education was offered only to rich people or to people who are entering the religious clergy or something like that. So not everybody received education. But with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, there were 3 major forces back then: urbanization, immigration, and industrialization, which meant that cities were forming. People were coming to this country and other countries who didn't necessarily speak the language or share a common culture, but they had lots of children who didn't necessarily have work. Meanwhile, factories were being built. That's why they were coming to these urban centers. And they needed employees who could be trained enough. In the field, you're very active, but they needed employees who could be trained enough that they could sit at the assembly line all day and get the job done and not revolt. So they needed essentially an army of sheep. And so the education system was created, they call it the factory model school. So it was created as a one-size-fits-all. Push in as many people as possible, no matter what their needs or talents or limitations are. And if you make it, great, you're fine. And if you don't make it, too bad for you, we'll still get what we need. And the order of the day was making sure that people were very good at listening to authority. That was the most important thing. And a lot of that, now I'm not saying it was 100% that, because there were education reformers that really did believe in education, really did try to find better opportunities, but there was a lot of this other stuff going on. And that's the legacy of our education system today. That's why we have to sit still in the classroom, and things are beginning to change today, but not fast enough. And so we see our public schools today focused on things like the Common Core, which is all content, when we know in about 2 years we won't even know whether any of that content is relevant or not. So, and the other thing that was very surprising to me about the education system is that very, very, very resistant to change. So I won't get into more of that, because there were quite a lot of ugly things that I saw, and I don't want to depress us. But there are a lot of interesting and very nice things going on, but the majority of them seem to be going on around the fringes rather than within the institutions. So let me turn this. So anybody see this map before? What do you think about this map? This was created by an Aussie. No comments? Usually what I hear from students is, that's wrong, right? But the question is why? Why is that wrong? Who got to choose that north is here and south is there, right? But we accept these conventions because that enables us to communicate, that enables us to come to a common understanding very quickly, but it doesn't mean it's right or true. But because we're not trained to question, we're not trained to necessarily think, we're trained to absorb information, follow the rules and things like that, when we see things like that, our first reaction is that's wrong. And this is mild. You know, what happens when you see somebody who behaves completely foreign to you? Your first reaction is that's wrong, and that's more dangerous than small things like that. But that's the way that we operate today. We operate thinking that we were taught what's right, that authority figures knew the answer, and so people go to medical school wondering what is the answer? You know, what is the cure for this major disease? And I don't know anything about medicine, but I would be willing to bet with anybody that we probably don't know much more than what we know today. And so this is one of the biggest barriers standing in our way. Our assumptions, what we believe about the world, and our, you know, the fact that it's very hard for us to question. If we went around questioning our assumptions all day, we would be very inefficient. But we have to start doing it more, especially as leaders, because remember, leaders are about destruction. They don't stick with the status quo. They have a vision for a better reality, which means that you have to do a lot of questioning along the way. All right, so here's another little example. The 2004 tsunami was very, very destructive, right? And the epicenter of the tsunami is right there in that center of those rings. And you can see that little box where they bracketed out Andaman and Nicobar Islands, because there are 3 tribes I want to tell you about. This is off the south of South Asia. Some of these tribes were actually part of India. So 2 of the tribes had never assimilated with civilization, and they stayed as far away from civilization as they could. And 1 tribe was forced to assimilate, but very unhappily. So they didn't really fit in, but they were forced to live in town and follow the laws and dress according to what was expected and all of that. So when the tsunami hit, the 2 of the tribes that were not part of the civilization, in fact, it's even hard to ever see them. 1 tribe noticed, oh, gee, all the animals disappeared. So they went up high in the mountains. And another tribe noticed, wow, all the fish are really far in the deep sea. Something must be happening. So they took their boats and they all went out to the deep sea, and not a single person was killed. Meanwhile, the tribe that was socialized and forced to follow the rules, they had as many deaths as everybody else. And we all know that there was a lot of death and destruction. Why? Because civilization thinks that they have the answer, that they're smarter, that the tribal ways are stupid, and they close their mind to maybe there's some ancient wisdom there. I mean, these aren't easy answers. There are some myths that aren't worth carrying forward, but there's got to be some wisdom there too. So how do we accommodate all of that in a world that's becoming more confusing and falling apart? My only answer is to keep your mind open. And this is probably the biggest barrier that we face, is our ideas about ourselves. What we're taught to think about ourselves, and it starts very, very young. Most of this is not conscious. So has anybody heard the elephant and the rope story? Okay, so some of you know it, but I think it's a wonderful story, and it's so true of the way that we operate as well. There was a man walking by a group of elephants, and he noticed that all of them were tied by pretty weak-looking rope to pretty weak-looking tethers, and he was wondering, why didn't they run away? So he asked the trainer, how is it that all of these elephants are just staying here very calmly with this very weak rope, and it's not even tethered to anything? And the trainer said, because when they're babies. We tether them and they're too weak to break away. So they eventually just associate that rope with being tied down. This is called learned helplessness. We assume that there's nothing that we can do. So we accept whatever it is that we're given. And this is the most dangerous thing. So I'm going to tell you a personal story about myself. I told you at the beginning of my talk that this leadership stuff is very resonant with me because I never fit in. Because my family immigrated here from Korea when there were almost no Asians in America, and most of them were in Hawaii. And so we came here to New York, and so I was always the only one. I didn't meet another Korean American like me. I barely met any Chinese Americans or any other kind of Asian Americans, but I didn't even meet another Korean American like me who was my age, who had immigrated in that time until I was 2 years out of Cornell. So, you know, I always assumed. And in those days, people didn't travel. It's not like today. In those days, it was very rare for anybody to go on an overseas trip. And so all I knew was that my home was completely different from my life outside the home, and there was no way I could explain one to the other. So I just stopped trying. I just said, you know, there's no way they can understand. They don't have the experience, and so, you know, I can appreciate like 70% or 80% of this experience and that experience. Just live with it. And so I lived most of my life from childhood to adulthood with this kind of assumption until about 10 years ago. And something happened that made me so angry that I spoke out. I said, you know, this is terrible, this is very racist, how could this happen, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't know what the outcome was because, you know, another part of my cultural training is not to complain, not to get angry, all of that. So this was very out of character for me. And you know what? They appreciated so much, that group. They were so grateful, they were very open to hearing. And what that made me realize is that the world had changed a lot. People were traveling, we had a lot of people from all over the world here. It was not the same environment that I had immigrated into, but I had stayed stuck in that past reality, which was no longer true. And so we ourselves are our own jailers. We ourselves create the ropes around our mind. So I encourage you to stay aware of that. And some of those barriers that we have, we associate ourselves, our identity, with the work that we do. And we are not our work at some point, especially in today's world. We don't know how long you're going to be doing that work. Maybe there's something else that you're going to want to do. Maybe you're not going to be allowed to do that work because that kind of work is going to go away. We don't know what's going to happen. But you are not your work. You're bigger than that. And at networking parties and things like that, we get in the habit of saying, well, I'm a student, or I'm, you know, a marketer or something like that. And we're not even in the habit of introducing ourselves a different way. A couple of years ago, there was a hospice nurse in Australia, Bronnie Ware, that put out the top 5 things, the top 5 regrets of the dying. And number 1 on the list was, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. I don't know about you, but I'm going to guess that you are probably a lot like me. I grew up with a lot of shoulds and a lot of what will the family think, and, you know, oh, my mother, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, who has to live your life? And if you're living it authentically and to its fullest, your mother, the family, everybody's going to be happy in the end. Number 2 on the list is, I wish I hadn't worked so hard, because when you're on your deathbed, nobody wishes that they worked an extra 10 hours in the week. I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings. So if you are not in the habit, like I wasn't, in the habit of expressing what you had to say, sharing your reality with other people, what you are doing is not only are you not engaging in leadership thinking, but you are creating a world that does not have you in it. because it's only through expression that you create an environment that has your mark. The next one is, I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. And I think this is a very sensitive issue today because we feel like we're always connected. But how often do we have those deep connections that are meaningful, that remind us of our humanity, that remind us how wonderful it is to be together? I would guess that it's not as often as it used to be before all of this technology started invading our lives. And the last and most important thing is, I wish I had made myself be happier. And with this, I want to say that your brain is the major culprit, all right? And especially you guys in this room, everybody in Cornell, we associate ourselves with our brains, right? We depend on our brains. Our brains are our friends. But you know what your brain is doing all day long? If you were to write down all the things that your brain said all day long, you would be appalled. If you were to say those things aloud to other people, they would run away from you because your brain says horrible things to you all day long. And what do? You don't fight back. You just absorb it. And you end up not feeling very good, right? We're brought up not to feel very good about ourselves. We're brought up to feel like we're not enough, we're not prepared, we need more, and there's always going to be somebody better, right? Why? Why do we do that to ourselves? If we don't advocate for ourselves, who else will do that? Your mother is not going to be able to do that full time. Only you are going to be able to do this job. And if you don't do it, nobody else will. So why in the world would you get in your way? So your brain is the bigger thing. So what I'd like you to do, and I want you to feel that you are ready. When I look back at all the major steps forward that I took, or that were allowed to me, because I've had some luck in my life as well. Just about everybody has luck if you're ready for it. It wasn't ever because I was ready. And in fact, if I had been given a choice, I probably, as your stereotypical Asian woman, say, oh no, I'm not good enough, I'm not ready, I need to study more. You know, my inclination is to get more information, which is not helpful. I still fight with that today. But always, your major opportunities are going to be for things that you are not ready for. And in the world that I described at the beginning of this presentation, our world is a world that we are not ready for. We need leaders who are ready to march forth in that world and help us show the way. You know, there's a very interesting story. There was a group, I believe it was Swiss soldiers, and this was about 100 years ago. They got lost in the Pyrenees. And it was in the middle of winter, and there was a strong chance that they would never be found. And there was only a small band of them. And so they were discussing what to do when it turned out that one of the soldiers had a map in his pocket. So they decided to make sense of the map and go out and find, you know, their way back to civilization using the map. And so eventually they did. And when they got back to the camp, the officers in the camp took a look at the map and said, how did you ever use this map to get back to the camp? Because this is of the Alps. This is not the Pyrenees. And so you don't even have to be right if you have a direction and get it together, because you will course correct along the way. So it's very important to have courage. Leadership is about action. And especially, you know, I imagine that there are a lot of perfectionists in the room. More action, less perfection, and you will move the world forward. So you are ready, whether you believe it or not, all right? So that's why I titled my talk Unbecoming, because I think we have to unbecome everything that brought us to this point and start thinking like leaders. Start thinking like individuals. Use the qualities, the attributes, the gifts that we were given with our cognitive abilities, with our emotional abilities, with our abilities to work together in groups. That's probably why we made advances, and you know, our closest cousins, the primates, have not, because we are able to build civilizations that have longevity. We can build upon our history. Let's use that to unbecome and get prepared to become leaders for the future. And start rethinking all of the things that make you feel bad. Do not allow yourself to feel bad. It's okay to make a mistake. A mistake is an opportunity for learning. It's certainly nothing to feel bad about. It's okay to have a negative experience. People have their peak moments during moments of friction. They never have peak moments when they're relaxing on the beach or things like that. You know, it's when they're struggling and they're striving to reach a certain amount of excellence, so that they're so focused on what they're doing. And that's when we feel most alive. And always remember to watch your brain. Don't trust your brain, because what you think is going to be what you become. And most of what we're thinking, we're not watching it. It's just happening on autopilot, and most of it is not good for us. And also, so you don't make yourself feel bad, but also if anybody else makes you feel bad, don't accept it. Either reject it, you know, ignore it or whatever, or push back, because other people also need to be educated. We can't be leaders alone. We have to be leaders by sharing our insights, our reality, our vision with those around us. And that includes sharing the way that we understand things as well. And this was also a lesson that I learned really late in life. I can't believe it. It happened about, let's see, almost 20 years ago. How long ago? I lose track because the years keep on going by. So almost 20 years ago, I came back after having been overseas for about 11 years. And when I first came back, I wanted to be an entrepreneur, so I spent a few years doing that before I realized that nobody trusts you if you've been out of the country for that long. And so not a good time to be an entrepreneur. So I went back into corporate life, and when I first went back, I hit up all of the headhunting firms, and Heidrick & Struggles is one of the leading executive recruiting firms, and there was this crusty old man there who had the gall to tell me that everything that I had achieved in Korea, I had only achieved because I was a Korean American. And you know what? I believed him, because I thought he was an authority. I thought authorities knew what they were talking about. So he told me that I didn't deserve the jobs that I had, when actually, if I had thought about it, just a few of the things that I did in Korea. So I was the third female advertising executive ever in Korea. I was the first woman to run an industrial company who didn't inherit it or buy it with family money. I also turned around the Levi's business. Levi's was failing all around the world, and we turned around the business from an 80% sales drop, became #1 in the market. So I had a fair number of accomplishments, but I believe this man because that's what I was taught to do, to believe authority. And I spent a few years feeling pretty bad about myself as a result. And it was only when I realized how broken the education system was, and I got back into the workforce and started working alongside people and realizing, yes, I still know how to work, I can still do a good job, that I slowly built my confidence back. So don't accept other people's realities. Your job is to explain your reality to them. They cannot define who you are, only you can define who you are, so tell them. And most important of all, accept yourself, forgive yourself, love yourself, and remember, no matter what, no matter how bad it is or how good it is or anything like that, you always have a choice. So whatever happens today. The other thing that makes it very hard to think like a leader is people who have a lot of options have trouble choosing, right? That sounds familiar? So that's okay, because you don't have to live with your choice for the rest of your life. You only have to live with your choice for this minute. You can change it the next minute. So just move forward, take an action, all right? And so finally, to help you do all of these good things. There are many, many things that we're learning from cognitive science and neuroscience and all of this experimentation that's coming out recently. And so you guys are probably familiar with the power posing work that was done by Amy Cuddy. You may have heard about growth mindset with Carol Dweck. This is very interesting. How many people are familiar with Carol Dweck's research? Yeah, it's quite amazing what they've done with the students. So Carol Dweck herself was a poster child for the teacher's pet. growing up. And so when she was offered opportunities to, because she was always number one, when she was opportunities to take her talents further by going to the spelling bee or entering this competition or entering the county science fair, she always turned them down because she was scared to death of breaking her image of being number one. She wasn't going to take any risks. And that's what she found out through her research. Students who are told that they are smart, that they have these intrinsic qualities that enable them to achieve, they don't take risks. They don't enjoy it. They will shy away from hard work and hard thinking. But students who are told that they are working hard, they find the pleasure in the work. They push themselves further. A group of fourth graders, she tested 400 fifth graders, sorry, in New York City. And the group that was told they were intelligent, everybody was asked to do a puzzle. And one group was told they were intelligent. The other group was told they worked hard. So then they were given an opportunity to do a second puzzle, a hard one or an easy one. And almost all of the students who were told that they were intelligent chose the easy one. 90% of the students who are told that they worked hard chose the hard one. And the stories go on and on. So when you feel that you're not doing something well, it's as simple as saying, instead of saying, I'm not good at this, or condemning yourself in any way like that, saying, I'm not good at this today, but if I try it, I can be better tomorrow. So it's as simple as that little twist of phrases. And anxiety reappraisal, there's also some other interesting research that has been done with regard to stress. Stress can be good or stress can be bad, and believe it or not, what you think about it makes all the difference. So if you think stress is bad, your chance of mortality can go up by 43%, according to recent research. If you think it's good, you're going to be stronger and healthier than people with no stress in their lives. Because what does stress do when it's used positively? It gives you energy. It makes you feel alive. It makes you perform at a higher rate. So this is called anxiety reappraisal. When you feel nervous about something, instead of saying, I feel nervous, say, I feel excited. And when they've tested that, they've seen that students going into exams have had higher exams. People going to negotiations have done better. People going to interviews have also performed better. And I am running over a little bit, but I'm almost done. And then there's another 3 goods exercise, or they call it, what else do they call it? The gratitude exercise. And this comes out of the work being done in positive psychology. It only takes 5 minutes a day, but if you can think of 3 good things that happened to you that day, why they were good, and what you can do to get more of that good thing in your life. And just spend 5 minutes writing down those things. If you do that for 20 days, you find that you're changed at the end of it. And the last thing I'm going to tell you is meditation, because meditation will change your brain before you even know it. You will become smarter, calmer, and happier if you meditate just even 5 minutes a day consistently. They found amazing results after even one session. So, in conclusion, this is something that I wish I had learned earlier, because I spent my whole life trying to find myself until I realized that there was nothing to find. I had to create it. So that's it. Sorry I went over. Sorry. Thank you.
Can maybe take 1 or 2 questions that are quick. Feel free if you need to run to classes or anything to get going. No? Another round of applause for Young Me.
All right, thank you. Thank you for letting me join you today.